Hey, everybody, it's Congressman Jamie Raskin. Hello to all my friends out in Maryland's beautiful 8th Congressional District and all of our friends beyond throughout Maryland and even across the country. We've got such an extraordinary local hero for you this week to celebrate and observe Juneteenth, which is the 19th. But our local hero is John Franklin, who is a distinguished constituent of mine and has had a remarkable career working in the field of African-American history and studies. And he is a direct descendant. He is the grandson of a lawyer who survived the Tulsa massacre and brought litigation relating to the Tulsa massacre and the rights of African-American citizens in Oklahoma. He's also the son of the famed American historian, John Hope Franklin. And so, John, for all of the work that you've been doing at the African American History Museum, at the Smithsonian, and just teaching every day all over the country, all over the world, you are our local hero. Congratulations for this week.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. I also had the pleasure of serving on and chairing the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. And during that period, we expanded the Banneker Douglas Museum in Annapolis and built the Reginald Lewis Museum in Baltimore.
I mean, it's remarkable the number of things that you've been involved in and engaged in. I mean, one way to start this might be to sort of compare your orientation to your dad's. Your father was a remarkable historian and an academic. You've been much more directly engaged in trying to make history like a living thing for people through museums. And I wonder if you would kind of just compare the way you shaped your career to the way you saw your dad's.
Well, my father taught not just in the university setting. He taught in prisons, he taught in churches, he taught in schools. And we call that public history now. And I would follow him, particularly in New York, to different faith congregations where he would be asked to be a visiting preacher. And he would talk about our history. And very often the Brooklyn Public Library would send someone with books and they'd have a little display and they'd say, okay, these are Professor Franklin's books. And if you're interested in these subjects, here are other books you can read. So I was part of that public education experience very early. And I realized that the knowledge that we have to share more broadly than just in the classroom. When I started working for the Smithsonian, I assumed that I would be an anthropologist and teaching in a classroom. But when I began working for the Folklife Festival, initially in West Africa as their representative, and then coming here to Washington before crowds of thousands and thousands of people, a million people over the course of 10 days, you can expose people to information they would not get in the classroom. And so that's a continuation in a certain way of the kind of work that my father was doing. My mother, as I mentioned, was a librarian, so she's also was involved in making sure that people had access to information.
And your mother grew up in Montgomery County. She went to Jackson Road Elementary. She went to...
My wife grew up in Montgomery County.
Your wife grew up.
My mother grew up in Goldsboro, North Carolina.
I see. Okay, so your wife grew up here. And she went all the way through Springbrook here. Well, so where did you and your wife meet?
We met in DC in Labor Day weekend, 1983.
So, all right, and I want to go a little bit further back into your family history before we talk some more about what you've been doing around here. Your grandfather was a distinguished lawyer in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I assume his office was like on the Black Wall Street. Is that what they called it?
Yes, his office was on Greenwood. My father's people get to Oklahoma in the 1830s as slaves to Chickasaw Indians. The so-called 5 civilized tribes owned a total of 5,000 African-American enslaved people. And so when the US Congress passes the American Indian Removal Act in 1830, freeing up 75 million acres of land for white farmers in the Southeast, these native tribes walk to Oklahoma, which is called Indian Territory at that time, with their 5,000 slaves. And my great-grandfather David Birney, named for the family that owned him, establishes himself as a black cowboy, black rancher in the southern part of the state. His
After
seventh
he's
child,
emancipated? You mean he was emancipated?
he emancipated himself and fought. He registered for the Civil War as David Franklin, and he was able to collect a pension from the Civil War. The 5 so-called civilized tribes, of course, as slave owners, were Confederate supporters. And so my grandfather's the 7th of 10 children, the first to go away to college. He, of course, could not go to the University of Oklahoma or Tulsa University. He goes to Roger Williams University, a Black Baptist college in Tennessee, where he meets my grandmother, Molly Parker. And while they're away, this land that's been given to Native and African Americans is found to have natural gas and petroleum. So the wealth of Tulsa, which becomes the oil capital of the world at that time, is also shared with African American landowners who have petroleum and natural gas on their land. And they need somewhere to negotiate with the oil companies. So my grandfather is one of the people who is an oil leasing person. He negotiates with the owners, the landowners, and the oil companies. And so he's in Tulsa, May 31st, June 1st, established on Greenwood Avenue when the mob comes and destroys that community.
But everyone in your family survived the mob violence.
Yes, only my grandfather was living there. My grandmother and my father and his youngest sister were in an all-Black town where my grandmother was a school teacher, and they were planning to move to Tulsa at the end of June. The massacre occurs May 31st, June 1st. My grandfather is interned in the convention hall. My grandmother hears about the massacre and does not know if my grandfather has survived until he sends a note saying that he had been detained, he was okay, but there was nothing left for them to move to. His rooming house, his office, everything was destroyed. People looted the homes and then set fire to the curtains to make sure that the houses burned. So hundreds and hundreds of people are left homeless, and the Red Cross moves into the high school building, which they transform into a hospital and a place to distribute food and supplies to these newly destitute people.
Did he leave Oklahoma?
My grandfather? Oh no, he stayed there and practiced there until he died in 1960.
Did he stay in Tulsa?
He stayed right in Tulsa. He lived on Greenwood, and then he moved a little bit further north. My father's oldest sister married a gentleman who practiced law with my grandfather. So there were 3 generations of lawyers in Tulsa. My grandfather and his son-in-law, and then my uncle and his son.
Now, and you've done so much to educate the country about what happened there. I mean, I'm amazed at how much consciousness there is now about the Tulsa massacre, but talk about some of the work you did at the African American History and Culture Museum about this.
Well, I worked with the curator, Paul Gardulo, who was looking at how we could tell regional stories in the United States to help people understand the range of the African American experience over time and place. He called the exhibition The Power of Place. It's on the 3rd floor above ground of the National Museum. And I advocated for this being a story that needed to be told at the national level. And so Paul and I went for 8 years to Tulsa to collect the images, the postcards, the artifacts, the oral histories, the silent and audible films of that period so that we could share that with our visiting public.
It's an amazing thing. And now there's much more historical focus on it in terms of books and movies and
inadvertently,
so
the former president brought heightened awareness to it by visiting Tulsa on the 20th of June last year and bringing to light not only Juneteenth, but Tulsa massacre inadvertently to the national awareness. I was on a 60-minute piece that same week, which had been prepared long in advance. But many people who know that my wife and I, Karen, go to Tulsa twice a year, once they saw it on national television, said, oh, we get it now. We understand that this is really something important. We've been treated as though we were going to Tulsa on vacation until people really saw that this community was destroyed, and that Tulsa itself did nothing to help this community rebuild. Because their insurance companies refused to honor the policies, the people who were survivors had to rebuild with their own resources and their own elbow grease.
Well, John, somebody told me that you were retired, but you're not showing any signs of retirement to me. What tell us what you're working on now, and I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, I'm teaching a class tonight on Africans in the Americas at Oklahoma State University at Tulsa. I've been asked to lead some discussion groups. Corporations are very concerned that their employees are up to date on these issues and want to discuss race. I just got a call before our meeting this morning to lead some discussions at a law firm here in DC on race and look at Isabel Wilkerson's newest book, Caste, and Ibrahim Makendi's book, 400 Years, 400 Souls. So it's very exciting, and people are thirsty for this knowledge. There's so much that we don't know about American history, and I'm glad to show them the way.
Well, John Whittington Franklin, you're a local treasure, you're a local hero, you're also a national treasure too. So for everything you do to bring this history alive for us, to make sure that our historical memory survives, we salute you and we honor you this week. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Congressman Raskin. It's a pleasure.